It looks like the camera is. Testing audio, making sure that's working well. Hopefully audio is good. I just realized I don't have water with me, so I'm just going to quickly run to the kitchen and then we'll start. We're waiting for Calgary to just get their HDMI stuff sorted. Okay. All right, so our newly installed computer is going to read out text starting now. I unmuted it, so please keep that in mind, Calgary. And I'm going to plug in my computer in 1 second.
Testing.
Yep, testing, testing.
AJAX today, something new to suck at. At sea.
That's too good. Okay, so I think we're all set and ready to go. Audio's working. How is everybody doing? Good morning. We finally start. This is what I'd like to start off with. I don't know if you've already seen it or has people already seen this? No? This is my joke that I start with. You know, I like to start with a joke. This time it's not verbal. It's a GIF or GIF. And I think it's really appropriate because you've been working with CSS. I try to keep it contextual. You've been working with CSS, right, with Tweeter. And you're not alone in feeling like this is what it feels like sometimes to work with CSS. I like how the blinds like represent the like the page. It's just like I give up. That's too good. Okay. So that's the joke out of the way. We're going to be talking a lot about AJAX today. And as I've mentioned in my previous lecture with you folks, I like to work in the most incremental, kind of iterative, error-driven based approach possible during lecture to really drive that home. So while it's important for me to focus on AJAX, because that is like what you're going to be working with today to take Tweeter further, the truth is that you could probably do that without the lecture. The lecture is going to kind of introduce it a little bit, but you know the content can stand on its own and take you through that, in my opinion. So again, as I've said before, the lecture will definitely be more about the process of learning this stuff versus just, okay, let's like write some AJAX code and be done with that. So that's the philosophy I like to take. Before we start on the stuff, how has it been so far for Calgary, for Vancouver here, working on CSS? How has that been going? Has it been like this? Or has it been somewhat better? That's more accurate with jQuery for you. Interesting. Okay. Others? How has the jQuery DOM stuff been so far? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, jQuery as a library is quite monolithic, right? You can see from the documentation there's just so many different objects and functions that you can deal with. And the goal of it was to try and create a simple to use API to deal with the browser. But of course it grew over time, right? It started off quite simple and then it just kept getting stuff added to it. Today you can even do like animations and a bunch of interesting effects with jQuery. So yeah, the surface area, as I like to call it, of the library has grown significantly. And then throw in modern JavaScript that is kind of, that's awesome. I'm gonna kill Sam.
Something new to suck at. Why? At sea. https://twitter.com/INDEVLOPER.
Why is it reading it twice? Yeah, it read stuff twice. And I'm at like the worst possible time it's reading stuff twice. Oh boy. Where was I? So yeah, if this is gonna get this distracting, I might have to turn it off. I'll just say that, but we'll see how it goes. And if it starts being buggy again, I might have to turn it off. So yeah, the surface area of the library kind of grew, and then throw in things that that kind of went further in JavaScript. Things like promises, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit today, but will take a little bit longer for us to fully explain and get into. Then added more and more complexity and changes to the jQuery library. So I'm not surprised to hear that you're finding jQuery a little bit challenging to learn. This is going to be a theme in this program because the libraries that you're going to adopt are going to get more and more complicated, right? Whether they're framework kind of style libraries or just smaller a collection of functions like jQuery is, right? Any other thoughts from yesterday in terms of how things have been going? Are people generally feeling ready today to tackle the AJAX content, or are people still working on some of yesterday's content? Still working on yesterday over here, over there, yeah. How far through yesterday are you guys? Like halfway through, or near the tail end, or at the beginning? You're 95%? The last step takes a long time. What is the last step? Remind me. Oh yeah, you're making the tweet object from using jQuery code versus just having it hard-coded in there, right? Yeah, it takes a lot of jQuery code to get that going for sure. And the other problem or benefit of jQuery is that it can be, there can be many different ways of doing a lot of the things that jQuery gives. Again, because it's evolved over time, the same thing can be done like 3 or 4 different ways just with jQuery alone. And so that adds a little bit more confusion in terms of Stack Overflow answers, or the jQuery documentation itself is quite complicated with the different versions of things, right? And we'll see a little bit of that today as well with AJAX. So, yeah, let's continue on with AJAX though. So I understand that you will likely want to continue and finish yesterday's content and then start AJAX, but you know, here we are in lecture. It'll give you some context. It's okay after lecture for you to continue on yesterday's stuff. That's totally cool. Obviously, don't let it pile up. So find ways to make sure that you don't get stuck on something for too long. And we know what those strategies are, right? Everything from mentor help to peer help to changing your strategy entirely. If you're going down a path and you're like, I'm stuck on this, but do I need to be stuck on this? Can I actually try a different function instead? Those types of strategies. Okay, so AJAX. Does anybody here want to volunteer an answer to what is AJAX? I know we just saw a tweet from Calgary that kind of hints at it, but I'd like somebody here to take a stab at what they feel, if they, in case they already know from before or having done some of the readings, what AJAX is. Anybody? Remember your name again? Sarah basically said that you can put information into a form, or the page can make a request. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's like a synchronous request. Yeah. And so you don't have to go to a separate page, or you just have to reload it.
Yeah. Specifically that the requests for HTTP, it's not that there's no get or post, it's just that they're happening behind the scenes instead of hijacking the entire browser tab and spinning the browser tab to say, hey, I need to refresh this whole page. So the idea is that you're still doing HTTP gets and puts and posts and all of those verbs that you normally use. We're focused on gets and posts for now. You can do those, but they're done using JavaScript. And of course, JavaScript is asynchronous by nature. And so we're leveraging both the asynchronous nature of JavaScript as well as the browser to make a separate request behind the scenes that will not have a loading screen or anything of that nature, no spinner, and therefore be able to do things that are dynamic or seem dynamic in our application, so that we're essentially able to create a more flexible UI, essentially a more flexible user experience. So AJAX stands for, does anybody know what it stands for? asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which is quite confusing because nothing that we'll talk about with respect to making asynchronous HTTP requests has anything to do with XML. Of course, it has everything to do with JavaScript, so we're going to be doing asynchronous JavaScript. But heck, we were doing that earlier as well with Express and Node and all of that. So this is a very kind of poorly named feature. And I believe it was, I want to say Microsoft that created the initial specification for doing asynchronous requests, but I'm not sure, don't quote me on it. We can do a history lesson some other time. But this kind of had to stick because it became part of the specification, and XML was the way that it was done initially. The web community has kind of moved away from XML for the most part. You will still find certain AJAX things actually being XML. But for the most part, we've adopted another format for communicating data. Can you guess what that format is? It was in your weekend reading. I believe for Tweeter, it was in your weekend reading. But it might have been for actually your Tiny app. So instead of communicating data and submitting data with XML, which is another kind of format, we are instead using, we're using JSON or JSON. So really, we should be calling this asynchronous JavaScript and JSON, but that's not a thing, right? And so there's a little bit of naming confusion when it comes to AJAX. We still tend to use the word AJAX as a community, but we're also trying to move away from it. So we're in this like weird limbo where you'll still hear web developers say, oh yeah, let's make an AJAX request there. So I'll use that term. But oftentimes they'll just say like make an async request and leave out the like details of whether it's JSON or XML from the conversation because it's usually assumed that it's JSON for now. Right? So we'll just say the name is confusing due to its age and being attached to XML because today we generally like to use a simpler format, especially in the JavaScript ecosystem, but even outside of the JavaScript ecosystem. So in, for example, in things like languages like Python and Ruby, if they're used in the web and there's a server that's maybe backed by Ruby, one you'll actually work on with Rails later on, it will still tend to respond, if it's doing stuff with AJAX requests, it will still tend to respond and deal with JSON. And so we'll look at that as well. I'll just say especially in the web ecosystem. So far, so good. So what's interesting is, you know, as a result of this, browsers still tend to have this object called XML HTTP request. Right? Again, old and bad naming for an object that's supposed to be the underpinning of how you actually make these asynchronous requests. So confusing naming, don't get too caught up in it. Just know that it has nothing to do with XML. It is an HTTP request, and ideally it should have been called something like async HTTP request. But unfortunately, we didn't have the foresight to detach XML from the wording. So while we'll be using, we could be teaching you AJAX using this object, because ultimately this is what usually gets used by jQuery to make the AJAX request that we'll be making. So we'll be using jQuery for making AJAX requests. However, jQuery is just code somebody else wrote that can work in the browser, right? So it still has to work within the context of the browser, and so it has to use all of the browser's API, right? Because jQuery is constrained by the browser API, it uses the built-in XML HTTP request, or however that is. How is it written here? XML HTTP. Okay, so it's not all caps TTP. Is this font okay for the back? You able to see it? Cool. Questions, comments, anything so far? Okay. There is, I'm kind of hesitating if I should cover it now. What I'll say is we're also in a transition in terms of, because JavaScript is constantly evolving and browsers are constantly evolving, we're also in a little bit of a transition between what I just said, as well as another browser API that has been added that makes this a little bit more modern. So because this particular object is like really old, from like the Netscape days, I believe, so like pre-Internet Explorer even, another function essentially has been added that all browsers have eventually supported called fetch. There is another more modern approach to doing AJAX, or async requests, I should say. And instead of using the XHR object, let's call it, because it's XML HTTP request, so oftentimes you'll see XHR in code, which really just means XML HTTP request. So it's short for an AJAX request, really. It's another acronym that you, or another abbreviation that you may come across, so I'm just listing it out here. So instead of using the XHR object, modern code can or tends to use the fetch function. So if we Google that, let me just show you that quickly. I would just look at maybe MDN fetch. I'll just go over that really quickly. We will not be using fetch for Tweeter, but I just want to show you this because it is an interesting thing that is still important for you to know. So first paragraph kind of lays out what I was saying. The fetch API provides an interface for fetching resources, so making requests, including across the network. It will seem familiar to anyone who has used the XHR, but the new API provides a more powerful and flexible feature set. So essentially it's adapted to more modern JavaScript standards, instead of doing stuff in the way that it's written, a little bit more old school. And so we'll see that a little bit, but we'll also see the same kind of modern approach with jQuery, because jQuery is also kept up to date with the times. I won't go through fetch at all in the lecture, but let's see if there's a quick, like, first of all, in terms of browser support, it looks like, interestingly, I did not know that IE is like completely no across the board. That's interesting. Oh, because IE is different than Edge, I see. So Edge does support it, so that's basically latest IE. It's just a rebrand thing. I guess they don't have an example that's easy to using fetch. So it would look something like this. Again, we're not going to go through it, but I just want to show you a little bit of the code that that is used. Very simple function call at the very basic level. You give it a string to where you want to make the request, right? So this one's doing a actual get, it seems, because it's getting back some movie data in JSON format, and then with the response, it's converting it to JSON, and then with that JSON, it's console logging it. Not really the greatest example, but feel free to read this a little bit later. I wouldn't put it on your, especially if you're feeling a little bit behind with the content, write it down in your notes as something that you should cover and potentially even use for things like your final project, but not necessarily something that you need to worry about for Tweeter. But it does show you a little bit of the pattern that I was talking about, the more modern pattern, where the function itself doesn't take a callback. Do you see how fetch as a function, even though it's async, and what we've been told so far is when you have an async function, what do you do with its return values? You can't just say var return value equals fetch, because fetch is going to return something asynchronously. So what is our default answer to dealing with asynchronous code in JavaScript? What do we say? Pass in a callback function. Exactly. What you see here, though, is that the actual async function is not taking in a callback. Do you see that? And so that is a very different pattern that you're kind of seeing for the first time in dealing with both fetch as well as what you'll see with jQuery. We'll be doing something very similar with jQuery as well. And so you'll kind of see evidence of this like evolution of different patterns to deal with asynchronous code. And I'll talk to that a little bit. Even though it doesn't fall within AJAX, it's kind of becoming more and more necessary to speak to it now, because jQuery's AJAX library has remnants of that, and it's hard to use it without speaking to it, right? Any questions or thoughts so far? Okay. So let's actually jump into what we're going to be writing. So of course, as usual, we'll be going through the exercise in a demo kind of fashion where I have a little bit of boilerplate code. So let's take a look at the boilerplate code. This is a very simple boilerplate Express backend. The reason I say simple is that it literally doesn't do anything except for just bootstrap or set up our Express server. Notice how I use the word bootstrap? Also confusing, because bootstrap also happens to be a CSS library. They just ended up using a generic term, which really just means to quickly get going and start something up, right? They're helping you bootstrap the front end, but the word is often used just generically as well. So don't get confused when I use the word. I did it intentionally because it may happen again in the real world where you will see the word bootstrap used both to mean either to mean the framework, the CSS framework, or to just mean the verb itself of bootstrapping something. So yeah, I'm just basically bootstrapping a Express server that has content in a public directory. It has no routes, so we're going to create those. We're going to keep the actual use case pretty simple. I actually don't know what the theme of the app will be, so hopefully you guys will be able to help me out with that. And then I've got a little bit of front-end code as well, so let's actually just start up the server. So we'll have a form that will submit something, and we'll have a collection of things. I have no idea what those things are. So we can change that up. I would ideally not like it to be called a thing. I'm just not feeling super creative, so you guys are going to give me something really obscure to go with. And I guess Calgary can blurt out a few things, and then I'll pick whatever I like the most between Vancouver and Calgary. Sorry? Turtles. Okay, we've got turtles. It's a thing. Okay, yeah. Anything else? Fictional creatures. I like it's more abstract. What did Calgary say? Tortoise. So I guess it's types of tortoises? No. They're actually going for turtles. Disney characters? This is going to make me look quite dated and misinformed when it comes to Disney. Superheroes? Alright, it's getting interesting. Let's go with fictional creatures, because I feel like you can get like the most ridiculous possible data set from that. Because you could have like a superhero turtle that also maybe like resembles a Disney character, all as a fictional creature. So I feel like it kind of encompasses everything. and it's so abstract that you could just go pretty crazy with it. Let's go with fictional creatures. I like it. Fictional creatures it is. So in our index HTML that we've got set up with really nothing but Bootstrap, a title, and a form, which we'll update a little bit in time. And it may have one or more inputs so that we can actually type in some attributes of each of these fictional creatures. We said fictional creatures, right? Yeah. And then we will need an area to list them. So we have that. And then we've got jQuery loaded as well at the bottom of the body, along with, and the order matters here. So because we're going to be using the jQuery, we're going to add our app.js after jQuery. Before we go into writing code, so app.js is empty, by the way, I believe, or nearly empty. Before we go into writing any code, quick question for everybody. The JavaScript being at the bottom of the body, what's the deal with that? A quick review on that. I have two people that are generally answering, so I'm going to mute them.
Make sure the page loads before the JS is run.
What he said? Yeah, so it's our indirect way of saying DOM content loaded, right? Which is what I believe Calgary said in different words. Make sure the page loads before the JS is run. Absolutely. This is not the only way to do it. And there's like 3 or 4 different solutions that you can do here. This is one common solution that you'll find that some production or websites in the wild actually use, where if you view their source, you'll find their JavaScript at the bottom of the body. Though the truth is, with modern JavaScript applications and certain other enhancements to browsers, this trend is becoming less of a thing. So oftentimes, actually, it is still included in the head, and something like this is used if they're using jQuery, which is to wait for the document to actually be fully loaded. So this default jQuery and passing in a callback function is basically saying DOM content ready or DOM content loaded, whatever that callback is, for the browser to trigger before this JavaScript is run. Or another one is to actually, I believe, add like an attribute to the script, something like delay or async. I'm not sure because I don't really use it. But it essentially makes this load a little bit later. And I think that's another tactic that's used. But something for you to research as a stretch. We're going to stick with doing both. Just to be extra thorough, we're going to add our content to the bottom of the body, as well as use this content loaded thing. Why would we do both when it's not necessary to actually have the code in a callback function? Why would we still do the thing that we would normally do if the JavaScript was loaded before the body finished being fully converted into a DOM? So one guess from John is maybe because it's a browser compatibility thing, and some browsers you kind of need to be extra safe because they don't necessarily load it at the end. I don't believe that's true. It may be some obscure browsers, but for the most part, I can assume no, and still have a good answer for this question. So all browsers, let's assume, will still do this well if I don't do lines 1 and 3 and just have this, and I'll still be able to do DOM manipulation without having this weird race condition where the DOM is not loaded but I'm trying to modify it because it's at the bottom of the body. So then why would I still have this DOM content loaded or document ready trigger? Yeah. We avoid making local variables or global variables, I believe you meant to say, by doing it this way. So that's actually one actual real reason for this, for using a function to encapsulate all of our code, is forces us to not have global window level variables. Does everybody know what I mean by global / window level? Right? Any global variable that we create out here will automatically get assigned to the window object. But there's another reason that's a little bit more or less concrete than this, but has to do with more like philosophy of code as a hint. Whereas this one is a little bit more like, yeah, it makes you do something that's like a good practice. There's another one that's also about good practice, but at a higher level. Yep. Do you want to take a stab at it? Waiting for files to load like images or audio. It's a good guess because you're saying like maybe the DOM is loaded, but there's other stuff that you're still waiting to load, and so maybe you're being extra. It's a good guess, but actually it brings up a good talking point. Document ready is intentionally not waiting for all the assets to load. Like for example, if you have lots of images, right? Let's say you're on Flickr or 500 pixels or those like heavy or Instagram. Document ready doesn't mean that all the images on the page have loaded, because that would actually take a long time, and it's not necessary, because what you need is the DOM, which is the tree structure that represents the web page, so that it can actually render it. And then as it's rendering it, it's going to start downloading these images. Do we really need all the images to be downloaded before we can start adding behavior to buttons? Not really. And so there's a separate event that we could listen on for like everything is loaded. But what we really care about is the document ready or not, which is very different than is the document fully renderable with all of its assets. You can even attach listeners to specific videos or images to see is it been loaded or not. But though that's less conventional and only for like very specific use cases that we do that. This is basically, is the DOM ready, right? And so actually it's intentionally, we don't care about all the assets, CSS and images and all of that to be loaded yet. And most likely it's not loaded while we're triggering this code, because we want it to be fast, right? If we waited for all that, it'd be slow.
Something to do with how AJAX makes the UI user-friendly, how it's how it loads stuff.
No, I'm not going to repeat the answer just because it's a good guess again, but not. Let me give you a little bit more of a hint. Okay, so why do we do this? We do this when the script is before the body ends, right? That's when we need to do it. We need to do it then. We don't need to do it when it's at the bottom. Then why are we doing it? I know I just repeated the question, but I want to kind of emphasize that because the answer is kind of in the question. Just in case. Why would we do it just in case? You're on the right track with the answer just in case. One of the principles of software development is trying to decouple code. Right? We have HTML code and we have JavaScript code. We may have two different functions, but trying to decouple the expectations or assumptions between two functions as much as possible is good practice. And so here one could argue that app.js, although we as devs know we're putting this together, won't be loaded until the end of the body. We don't want app.js to make that assumption. App.js is still going to work regardless of where it's included on a page. Because who knows, maybe a developer wants to move it, or for whatever reason it stops behaving the way that we were told. So we're being extra cautious because we don't want to make assumptions where we don't need to make assumptions. Does this add a performance hit? A few microseconds at most, right? So it's not really something worth worrying about for most websites. Maybe if you're an Amazon.com and you've proved that a 1 millisecond delay causes this much drop in revenue, maybe then you have an argument for like being as effective as possible and compromising that like decoupling for performance. But the performance here is negligible, right? So that's our code so far. And so the second answer here is decouple the HTML from the JavaScript. And don't assume the JS will be appended to the end of the body. Okay. It's 9:46. I'm wondering if before we get into the meat of this, because they're also taking a break, why don't we take a quick 5-minute break before we really get into the details of the demo? And in the meantime, during break, as you're grabbing coffee or whatever, think about some fictional creatures, because I don't feel like being, I feel like you guys should be the ones being creative here with this stuff. How's that sound? Yeah? Okay. Oh, we've already got something. Oh, tardigrade. Nice. Although a tardigrade is not a fictional creature. Yeah, I would say like take tardigrade and maybe do what Star Trek Discovery did with tardigrade and make it fictional. Oh boy. I feel like you guys could be more creative, Calgary. I'm a little bit disappointed in the answers. Tardigrade and dragon? Dragon is totally real. Dragons exist. Tardigrades exist. Centaurs exist. Okay, doke. So we are back.
Test.
Okay, we're still working. Shall we resume? Ready to go? So we're going to create a simple to-do list-like application, except instead of to-do lists or to-do items, there'll be fictional creatures. We'll figure out some attributes of fictional creatures, ideally more than one so that we can see that working. So we'll maybe have multiple input controls, like maybe 2 input fields or something. And we'll want to be able to at least do simple CRUD. So maybe not all of CRUD, maybe not delete and update, but we'll start with like create and read and probably leave it there because I don't think you have to do all of CRUD to fully understand and appreciate AJAX, right? Then it's just a matter of applying the same principles to the rest of the potential functions or features that you can add to your application. So we talked about at length about this. We're going to leave that aside because we talked about the 2 reasons to maybe continue using both techniques. Okay, so I want to be able to support a list of fictional creatures. My Express server is completely empty in terms of any routes or anything. It doesn't have any data or fake database like our Tiny App or Tweeter. So we're going to have to fix that. And we have no client code in our app.js either. So we have 2 JavaScript files we're going to be working with, the app.js, which is client-side JavaScript, currently just doing a console log, and we have a server.js for our Express app, which will have the endpoints or routes for handling our asynchronous requests, right? Where do I start? What, in an incremental way, what do I want to do to start this off? Now, I know that you don't really know necessarily how to implement AJAX, so that's not what I'm asking. Think maybe in terms of more higher level, in terms of how you tackle this from an iterative approach. And eventually you'll get to a point where you're like, okay, now I need to look up how the hell to use AJAX. But I don't think we need to do that right off the bat. So using the same techniques that I talked about in my previous lecture, trying to do error-driven development, how do we want to start this? There's no one right answer here, but there are some error-driven development approaches that I'm going to focus on. I saw a hand go up, but I'll go with you. Yeah. So maybe 2 routes, one to have an error, and the other one that's more of a returns a hello. Interesting. You're writing quite a bit of code there, right away, without having an error condition. So what's my actual error condition to start off with? And again, even before I ask that question, we have to ask, well, which strategy are we taking? Because we're going to have both read and write. We're not going to implement them together. We may fully implement read first and then write. We may fully implement write first, then read. Or we may implement one kind of partially and then switch to the other, right? We don't know exactly. But what should we start with? And again, no right answer here, but maybe give a justification to your answer. Should we want to start with read first or write first? Should I be able to read fictional creatures or be able to create fictional creatures? Yep.
From like what we've been doing, it seems like having hard-coded database examples and then doing read first seems like.
So basically, sorry, your name again? So Tristan's saying basically based on what we've been seeing in content, maybe let's start with hard-coded content that you can download or read, because that seems to be easier to start with, and that seems to be the pattern that we've applied. That's the pattern I tend to like as well, because in order to create, I'm still going to have the collection of things anyway. At which point, yeah, let's do like the fetch first to see what's our content, and that way when we implement create, we can also fetch again to see if we created it successfully. So it gives us a little bit of a platform to test other features off of. So I agree with that. Let's start with read. So what's my error condition? Let me ask that question again. What's my error condition with doing a read on my list of fictional creatures? Anything from Calgary? Right now, I don't have any routes, right? And I'm going to be needing to download some dynamic data, which will be essentially a JSON, as we've been told, of the creatures. So I would argue that my error condition is trying to fetch the creatures, right? Since we're working on read first, right? So maybe I'm just going to create a route here. It could be anything, but just to be semantic here and something that's understandable, maybe it'll be something like creatures.json, right? What I expect, I shouldn't have hit enter there. What I expect is for that route to not work. Makes sense. I expect a 404. It doesn't work because there is no route of that definition. And that gets me to the point that you were making in terms of creating the route, but not necessarily two routes, because I've already got one that has an error. Let's make that one work, right? So app.get, because we're trying to fetch creatures. And this is potentially for you, given how much you've done it, maybe not fully yet, something that's kind of etched in your memory in terms of how to deal with Express registering new routes. So we have a callback using arrow functions, request response. That kind of will solve that error, but we know from doing this before in my last lecture, it's going to end up in a infinite loop, constantly waiting. So let's skip that particular error and just send back a hello. So what I expect now is to get back creatures.json, so my apologies. And that JSON is just, again, like that .json. It's not like that's needed. I'm just being very deliberate in my naming to say I'm going to get back JSON here. This is not something that necessarily our assignments will have you do, or that already do, I guess, because they already have the endpoints. So something to keep in mind. So now I'm getting back that hello. But it's a JSON endpoint, so it should actually be sending back data as data formatted as JSON. And so really a string hello is not valid as JSON. So really, I'm going to, just for the sake of working incrementally, my current error is I don't want hello, I want like an array of creatures. I'm going to have an array of objects. Okay, this is the point where I need a little bit of like creativity. What are some of the attributes that we'll want for our creatures? Color. Yeah, I like that. So we'll have to figure out a color, and of course it'll have to have some kind of a name or identifier, right? You guys are I was thinking something like damage. You know, like how much damage can this creature do? Or like hit points. You know, I'm going straight to like, violence here. Is it cute? Does it fly? Yeah, I mean, those could be things that we have as well. So maybe we'll have like a type. You know, maybe it's like a land versus air versus like aquatic creature. And I have too many here, so I'm going to go with the two that I like. I don't think we need so many strings on a particular object. So we'll go with these three. And maybe throw out some names. I'll assign damage and type. A capybara? I was going to say. I'm going to spell it like this even though that's wrong. A chimera. Okay. That sounds like a pretty badass creature, so we're going to go with a high damage, and we'll make that like a number perhaps, out of 100, so this one's going to be like a 70. And this one is a flying creature. Give me one more and then we'll return back to code. Bigfoot, I like it. Bigfoot versus a chimera. Yeah, I don't think Bigfoot's going to survive that one. Um, well, in terms of damage, we only have one attribute. We don't have like ground versus air, so that's going to get tricky. Let's go with ground. All right. So now we have a little bit of dummy data, and we can send it down. So I could just do, instead of send a string, I can send the object. Let's see what that looks like. You may not know exactly what that will do, but you know, there's merit in experimenting. What do we expect will happen here? What will I get back? Object object is one guess, I guess. You're saying that with a question mark in your sentence, so I assume you've never done that. You're taking a guess. Object object is one reasonable guess, because you know it's an object. We're trying to stringify it, and therefore, sorry, yeah, but an array is an object. An array is an object, so object object with arrays is not unseen. So it is a good guess. Any other guesses? There's one other potential thing that can happen. Yep. Just the contents, so like it just takes out the strings and concatenates them or something like that. Is that what you're saying? Or maybe something like that, maybe just the contents. There's one other reasonable guess that hasn't been guessed yet. It could just look like a JavaScript object, so it could actually do the JSONification of it, because that's what JSON is, right? Just a string version of how you write it in code, for the most part. The only difference with JSON is it tends to add and be extra safe by adding double quotes to each of the keys. JSON explicitly requires that, whereas JavaScript does not. So let's see. Let's take a stab at it. Those are all reasonable guesses, and it seems like Rachel is correct. I remember your name. That's pretty impressive for me anyway, given all that mercury that I drank as a kid. So yeah, we've got a JSON response without even using the word JSON. So it seems to me, just learn something, pretend learn something, that I don't have to do res.json, which is another function that I can call to send back JSON. This one's a little bit more explicit in terms of what my intentions are. So I prefer to use this, but you could just use send as well. So I'm going to hit refresh, and we'll see that that does the same thing with .json. I'm going to stick with .json, but interesting to learn that send does that magic for us behind the scenes as well. What is that magic that it's doing? Not much. All it's really doing is json.stringify, and then passing in the object. Whether it's an array or an object, doesn't matter. Both are valid JSON inputs, right? You could have a top-level object, because it's not a collection, or you could have a collection of objects. But essentially, behind the scenes, you want to convert it to a string, because HTTP is all about sending data back as strings, right? And JSON is a string format. Any questions? I saw a hand go up. Anything from Calgary or Vancouver? Nothing? Okay. What's next? So I've got my data coming down, but notice I didn't write any AJAX. I basically just took the traditional HTTP approach that I would have maybe taken with Tiny App in terms of implementing an index.html, right, or an index route. Just let's see if that particular thing works. Instead of having HTML come back, though, I just have data coming back. That's the only difference, right? So in terms of that incremental practice, a lot of transferable skills / techniques that you can bring from previous knowledge. In terms of what's next, I guess we should probably consume this from our JavaScript, right? From that app.js that really right now only has a console log. So that's where we are starting to get a little bit into our AJAX code. So here, while we could use the XML HTTP request object, we will not. It's a little bit more complicated. Yes, it's what's really being used underneath. We think it could also be fetch that's used underneath by jQuery. It depends on which version of jQuery, and if jQuery has moved over to using fetch, which I showed you earlier. I'm not sure. Ultimately, I don't care, because I care about just being comfortable with the jQuery pattern of doing this, the jQuery philosophy of doing this. So what does that look like? Well, we could do jQuery AJAX request, and specifically we're trying to do JSON. Oh. That's interesting. Looks like the jQuery API documentation immediately talks about there's an AJAX method on the jQuery object, and B, there's a getJSON one as well. Let's take a look at getJSON, because it sounds a lot more specific to what we need. It takes in a URL, it takes in data, and it takes in success. And it returns, it seems like, some kind of object that we can click on and look at more detail. The URL looks like it's required because it's not in square brackets. And what's interesting about jQuery, but also confusing, is that these square brackets, we know what these mean, right? These mean, in documentation, it means optional, right? But what's interesting and confusing at the same time is it's saying that we could pass in the data and we could pass in the success. A separate could have, not together necessarily. So you could actually just do URL and data, or you could do URL and success, or you could do URL and data and success. If you're doing all three, you have to do them in that order. Whereas if it was just one square bracket with data comma success, then it would imply that you either do both or neither, right? So what's interesting is if we were to implement that in JavaScript ourselves, we would actually have to write a pretty flexible function to test what that second argument actually is, because it could be data or it could be a function, a success function, or callback, as we call it. And so jQuery does a lot of if statements underneath because it tries to be very flexible with its function parameters. This leads to confusion as well, because you'll come across code that follows very different kind of techniques. This flexibility also brings confusion, right? I think I said this in my last lecture. With great power comes great confusion. And so that can kind of happen with jQuery as well, even though its intention is to not do that. Now, what's interesting is right away it says this is shorthand for the AJAX function. So there's a built-in AJAX function that's shown here, and you could literally call the AJAX function yourself, or you could use getJSON, which just pre-populates the AJAX function with this information. So it's kind of just a nice little layer on top of $.ajax. And again, we're seeing an example where jQuery, there's multiple ways of doing the same thing. I could just use AJAX directly, or I could call getJSON because it's more specific, because I want to get data type JSON back, and it will just do it this way. So let's take a look at trying to do it this way and see what happens. And then we can also try it this way if we have time. Cool? So what I need to do is get JSON, and I can just put in the path to the relative path to that particular endpoint. Because I'm running on the same domain and I'm fetching data from the same domain, I don't need to say this. I think it's 8,000, right? Oh, it's 888 or quadruple 8. I don't need to do this. This will work as well, but it's implicit. Just like with images, I can do an image source equals / something if it's on the same domain, right? Same idea, or CSS files or whatever. We're doing the same thing with our HTML, right? Here, our JavaScript file ideally should be like this, /js/app. It's not the full domain. And so this, but for jQuery or Bootstrap, we need the full path because it's not on our domain. It's some other domain. Same thing applies here. Okay? Apparently, this is all we actually need to run an AJAX call, because the other parameters were square brackets. So technically, this is the minimum amount of code I can write to implement something. What's going to be my expectation? Well, apparently this will actually do an XHR or XML HTTP request as a GET. Let's see that in action. Wrong one. This one right here. And we're going to go to our home page. Nothing in console at all when I refresh. And since I wrote this in the client JavaScript file, I don't even need to restart Node because it reads that file every time I make a request. And so this one's not cached in memory, and so I don't need to restart Node. And so that's not the mistake that I haven't made that mistake. So where do I check? Well, perhaps the network tab. Oh, look. Not only did it load the document and then proceed to load the CSS and JavaScript, and then our JavaScript, it also made a XHR request. Because if I filter by XHR, I see that there's only one thing, and that's the get JSON request that I just made to creatures JSON. and I see that the request basically says I'm looking for a JSON object, or JSON document rather. And that's about it. That's like pretty much the most important stuff. Obviously the get and the path are important as well. And then the response says, yeah, here's some JSON for you. And it includes a payload, which is the response that we saw in our other tab, which we can also preview because Chrome is nice and allows us to traverse the JSON in a more friendly way as developers. But really that's just taking the JSON and making it into a nice little tree structure for us to navigate. Question from Tristan.
We had things other than that in there, like HTML, then would it also grab that and put it in JSON?
That's a good question. What about if the response contained HTML? Now, does your question mean that the whole response is HTML, so it starts with the tag, ends with the tag, closing tag, or that it contains HTML as one of the attributes?
Like when it does the .get JSON, does it pick and choose the JSON that's already in there, I guess, or does it turn things into JSON and just return them?
So what's happening here is Chrome is making, DevTools is making sure that this is indeed valid JSON, and therefore able to preview it to us. In terms of your question with regards to jQuery, though, I think what you're asking is more in terms of jQuery. We haven't even seen the effects of that yet, because all we've done is make the request. We haven't even been able to access the data yet. So let's come back to that question. Remind me to address it if you feel like it still needs to be addressed in a few minutes, if that's cool. Any other questions? Okay, so, apparently I can pass in data, but I have no data to pass because I'm making a fetch. I'm not giving some kind of search query data or anything like that because I'm not capable of doing that right now. So I literally have no data, so I could pass in like nothing, or I could just skip that because of the 2 square brackets and go straight to the callback function. So here we're going to have a callback function that takes in something. We don't know what that is. Let's call that data or response. Right? So this is the response coming back from the server. And let's just console log it because we're still discovering how this thing actually works. Again, this is how I'd like you to work in class, right? Even if an assignment tells you to do more than this, you should work in smaller steps so that you fully understand the full code that is trying to get you to like write in. Okay, so console log response. I expect some kind of object to be printed out. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's actually the data that comes back. Let's take a look. And I could look at the documentation as well. What does the success callback, the callback function, take in? Oh, look. Its success has to be a function, and it actually can take in up to 3 parameters. The first one is the most important, which is a object of type data. So I already know what's going to come back is my data based on documentation. Let's confirm that by refreshing. No server change, so I can just refresh here. And what I expect to see now is a console log. And indeed, I have access to the data with just attaching a callback function to that function call. Am I going too slow or is this okay? Yeah. Oh, am I going too fast or is this okay? It's okay? All right. So we've got our data here. And now we can actually do a for loop and traverse through it, right? So that's good. What the heck is the other parameters, you might ask? Well, it seems like you get back some kind of text status, whatever that is, so we could try and experiment with that if we want. And then some kind of XHR object. Okay, let's just have it in there, even though we may not use it. Why? Let's just, for learning purposes. Let's output all 3 and see what they look like. Again, that kind of curiosity and learning through experimentation is highly encouraged, even if it may not be in the tutorial that you're following. So the second parameter is success. I guess it's just a string of whether it was successful or not. We can read more about it if we like. And then some kind of object from jQuery itself that tells us about something. It seems to have things like abort, always, catch, done, fail. It talks about a promise. There's a status code that comes back that we could also look at if we didn't want to look at the success string. This seems familiar to us. It's the HTTP response status. So 200 means there's valid data. A 500 would mean some kind of server-side error. A 400 series error would mean some kind of client-based issue. Right? So we'll come back to what this object actually is, because we're going to get into talking about promises when we do that. So I don't want to tackle it right away when we're talking about AJAX. So far, we've got the data. Now we can actually use that data to manipulate the DOM and display our creatures to the page, right? Any comments or questions before I move on from that? And if not, what do I do next? What can I do next? Do we want the data to be shown in like actual to the user versus just to the developer in the console? That's a really good question. I would say yes. So how do we work incrementally towards that? No, that was the answer I was looking for. So next question is, how do we work towards that? Yeah, let's actually like dig into the data, loop it, maybe for now console log it to work incrementally, but ultimately use that loop to see if we would want to create elements each time from the loop, because what we have is data and what we need is DOM elements, right? And so we can do that here. So I'm just going to comment that up. Oh, yes. I like how emojis are read out. So yes, could you repeat questions? So that was more of an answer. My apologies. I was repeating the answer, which was, could we actually go ahead and loop through the data and create elements from each of the items in the data? And I threw in let's console log as we go. So we could use a for each here, or we could use an ES6 for of. So let's go with for let creature of creatures and console log creature. So instead of console logging the entire array, which had the square brackets in the output, we expect to now see each one console logged separately. Again, client-side code only, so no need to restart. Refreshing. Oh, creatures is not defined. So error, because I'm not actually calling it creatures. I would argue that instead of saying data, let's be a little bit more specific on what that data is. I often see us writing, even senior developers, writing data there, but really the data actually has meaning already to the developer, so why not call it that? So I would argue that that should say creatures right off the bat. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes the data is not something you can label easily, and data is maybe the only thing you can really say, or response. But in this case, we can do better. So let's call it creatures, and hit refresh. And indeed, now I'm seeing 2 console logs, one for each object, or one for each creature. At this point, I need to actually take that data and turn it into an element, right? That's my kind of situation. So instead of calling console log, I'm really going to call create creature element and pass in the creature. Because, I mean, I could write that logic here, but I know to work in a modular way as I go where possible. Yes, I could do all of this code in here and then modularize it by moving it into a function. But if that's something I'm already comfortable with, I should just do that right away. And again, using error-driven development, where I write the function call, expect it to fail, and then define the function. And we can just say creature here. Because it's taking in one item at a time, and we can just move our console log into here. And so now we expect that function to work and console log as it was before. And we should go from here in terms of actually creating the element. Now this might be a little bit of a review from yesterday, I think, in terms of the stuff that you guys are still working on. So that'll be a nice thing to focus on, which is how do we use jQuery to then create the DOM elements that we need, right? You know how at the beginning of lecture I said jQuery had to kind of keep up with JavaScript evolving? Well, one of the things that came out in ES6 was template strings, which allow us to actually create a string with string interpolation. So we're not using concatenation, using pluses everywhere. And we could just use template strings. A lot of modern JavaScript code that creates client-side elements on the fly, like we are doing here, actually just use template strings instead of all the jQuery code. And so I guess I'll show you both examples. So here, let's just do it with template strings and see what that looks like. And then we can do it with jQuery, which is a little bit more OG jQuery. So what would that look like? Well, we would have our const element equal, and we'd start a template string, and template strings can be multi-line, so we can just put in our div, which would then have maybe class equals creature. What's nice is I can use double quotes without having to escape them. That's nice. Put a div here, and so far I'm just going to work in small steps. So really I'm just going to do creature dot, and then we know what attributes we have, dot name, and just keep it simple like that, right? And then maybe we could just console log the element. This is not really the element though, this is just a string that represents the element. So it's a little bit of a confusing name. I expect the two strings to be there. Yes, they have a new line before them because I have a new line here, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. I already have HTML now. I just need to append it to the DOM, right? That part is a bit easier. Again, you can do this with or without jQuery. Without jQuery would be something like, get the element using document.get element by, let's say, ID. We've done this before in even the prep course. Give the actual ID of the element, dot, and then you could use something like inner HTML equals, and then you'd maybe replace it with some additional inner HTML. This is a little bit more laborious because it doesn't allow you to append easily. I guess you could do plus equals. It's not necessarily considered the most kind of ideal code. And if we are using jQuery, let's just be consistent and use jQuery. So where are we going to append this? It seems like this class of all things. Let's call it all creatures, or creatures list. So really, we're going to do that in creatures list. So either in this function or outside of this function, we'll need a variable that points to that particular DOM node, which is this section here. And I like to prefix any jQuery objects with a $sign. It's again just a convention. Some people do it, some people don't. Just be consistent. And here it's just making it very clear that this is a jQuery object. It's not, how Sam yesterday talked about there's the browser-based node, but then jQuery adds a nice little wrapper around it, which is a jQuery object. So this is kind of making that very clear to the developer. And so here I am fetching the list, and then I'm going to append to that list. Append is a nice jQuery function to just add more HTML using kind of inner HTML type logic. Does this look okay for now? I did a little bit more than incremental development there, but still pretty small steps. Let's refresh. What do we expect to happen when the page loads now? We expect to see hopefully two divs. Divs tend to be on new lines unless they're explicitly made floating or something. So we expect to see two stacked divs with no real formatting that just have the names in them. Okay, so let's do that. Create list is not defined. Oops, I have a typo there. Create list, creature list dot append. Indeed, we see that right there, right? So this is essentially similar to our tweets, except I did it in a kind of ES6 friendly approach versus a jQuery friendly approach, right? So much simpler. You can see that it is valid DOM nodes, right? And it does contain the div creature. Notice that I didn't just assume that it was, because who knows, it could have just been text. I just wanted to make sure that it is indeed what I expected it to be. Any questions so far? Lots of questions so far. Yeah, we'll go with you first.
Just in terms of how we would actually build out is it preferential to do it as a template string or as
Yeah, the way our assignments get you to do it is more the painful approach of using jQuery functions to get comfortable with jQuery.
but typically within a real environment, is it better to do it
Yeah. So let me repeat the question. Actually, I forgot to repeat the question. Which is better, right? What's more used these days? Which is more common? Should I be doing it this way or the way that our assignments tell us from yesterday? It depends. What's more important is that you are consistent. In terms of how you're doing it for the assignment, you're not going to fail the assignment or have it rejected if you're using template strings. So you could use template strings. But I would argue that you should do it with the jQuery approach. That's a little bit more painful, so you're getting comfortable. And then later on, you can refactor to the easy approach instead of just, skipping directly to this. Now, of course, that's the ideal. If you're like, I don't have the time, and I'm just going to do it this way, I don't think it'll burn you, but you're just missing out on a learning outcome there, right? So that's my answer to which way to go. I haven't shown you the jQuery approach, so we'll do that as well right away. Any other questions? Sorry, we had another one from Rachel. You okay? Okay. That was like really simple, and of course we would have more information here, right? But I'm just going to leave that aside because we get the idea. We could have spans in there. We could have nested DOM. It will automatically take. jQuery is nice enough that if you pass in append, it automatically sees, oh, that's HTML you're trying to append. I'll convert that to DOM node, and does the whole DOM node conversion for you, right? So it does all that work that you're essentially doing up front. Okay, so let's actually write a different function, and we'll do a little bit less incrementally since we already have a little bit written out. And here we'll also append the element, but our element is actually going to be created using jQuery functions. So what does that look like? What do I actually write here in order to create nodes using jQuery? Yeah, add an element. So is there a function call? What do I use? $sign seems to be the thing that we always use for calling jQuery, which is synonymous with jQuery, but it's just shorter. So we have the jQuery function that we're calling there, and give it a tag name. Yeah, exactly. Instead of doing a dot or a pound as a string, which is more to like fetch. So weird, right? Like the function can do so many different things. Again, like it's flexible but also confusing. Because why didn't they just have different function names for these different operations? Well, just the authors decided this was more convenient. So anyway, we'll pass in a div like this, right? To create an element. Or did you guys, I see some.
We did it where Sam mentioned to us we should do it without closing queries.
Sure. So you just do it this way? Yeah, that should work also because it's smart enough to go, oh yeah, you meant to mean an empty div. Both will work. So this is a little bit more clean, I guess, or shorter. Good point. And then, yeah, and then we can start like doing things to that element, right? And so we could even actually like not terminate there and actually go dot add class to add creature dot add oh yeah, you could use dot, is it dot css? It's not dot, okay, so dot c, is dot add class is also a thing. Yeah, so dot css does inline style, right? It's a bit confusing as a name. It's more like dot inline style, which is generally something you want to try and avoid as much as possible. Sometimes you do need to use it to like, because you don't want to use a class, but most of the times you want to use a class so that you're separating your style from your HTML as much as possible. Right. So for example, Sarah's saying I used .css to do. I think it takes an object, right? And so I think it could take an object or a string. So you could do something like color red, and it will do like a style attribute with color red as the string. I would argue that you should use a class called error, and then you should just add the class error, and then there should be an error class defined in your CSS that applies the style. So you're separating those two things out. And then later on, error could be not red and orange, and you don't have to modify JavaScript code because it's stylistic code, right? So that's just like slightly better practice. But you'll still see that technique used in some code. I just prefer, and the community generally agrees on CSS for styling. So we'll do add class. Creature, we're not doing much with the class right now. And then we can, for now, just do .append. Like we'll just .append the creature name for now, right? So really it'll just have, or we can just do .text, because the creature name is not HTML, it's just text, so we can do something like this. So that's our element. We console log it just for debugging, but really we append it right away. And instead of using this one, we'll use this one. And so let's call number 2. And again, no need to restart. Let's refresh. And indeed, still continues to work. Div class equals creature. Let's just make sure and be extra careful. Creature 2 as my class. Make sure that that is indeed working. Right? Because I want to see a difference in what I did before and what I do now. Any questions about this so far? If I wanted child elements inside of this div, I could create them as separate variables and then use append. And essentially kind of work backwards or inside out, where I create the inside most span or div and then keep appending outer divs with those inner divs, or inner elements, I should say. So
And you would append them to elements.
you would append them to the outermost element, which probably poorly named. Maybe it should be called like creature element or something. But yeah, essentially you'd add it to the outermost element that you're appending, and that's the one that gets appended to your list. I would also argue that this function name is bad. Does anybody know why I would say this function name is bad? Not the 2 itself, but what's misleading or confusing about this function name? It makes it seem like you're only making one creature is the answer that you're going with, but I would argue that that's actually what it is indeed doing. It's not creating multiple. It's taking in one creature data, and it's creating one creature element. So that is a correct, like the singular part of the name is actually good. Somebody just said, John just said it's not creating anything, and it's just listing. The truth is it's actually creating and appending. Agreed? It's doing both. So it's actually doing two things, and the function name just implies that it creates an element. So if something is called create element, I expect it to create an element and return the element. So I would actually argue that these should be two separate functions. This one should actually create the element and not do this behavior, and should just return element. And then I should have a separate function, append creature, which takes in the creature element, right? And does this code here. This one is not going to necessarily return anything because it does more of a DOM change. And so here, you might be tempted to say, okay, let me call that function from here. Let me call append creature here, because look, it's a different function now, and I can just call that function from here. If you do that, you made the same mistake that I had already made, which is now, just looking at what this accomplishes, it does both create and append. No, that's not what we want. One thing at a time per function. So create and return, and then something else should be responsible for passing that same thing into append. So here, what we'll really do is call it from outside. From the thing that calls create element, it will take the return value and then it will pass it into append creature. That's great. I'm glad to hear that. And so it's a good review of that. In terms of separating out functions, you could have not done this, and if you don't, it's you don't realize the benefits until later. When you're like, oh, I need a function that can just do this. Ah, I kind of already do that. Now I need to split up that function. So whether you do it now and don't pay for that later, or you don't do it now and then you pay for it later, up to you. It's also okay to refactor as you go, refactor later versus as you go, right? But as much as you can, try to get comfortable with writing modular code at the beginning, so you're not building up too much of that code debt, the debt that you have to pay later.
Repeat the questions, please.
Which question did I not repeat? I was okay. I will try to repeat questions, but I'm pretty sure. Okay. So
The one you just answered.
what was that question? Can you repeat the? What was there a question that was just asked?
Oh, it was just my comment, yeah. That was, I was just commenting saying that was pretty much.
Oh yes, your point about this is something what we're already doing in the assignment, and yeah, absolutely, it's a good review of that assignment. Sorry for not repeating that. Any other questions or comments about this? Anything that's like unclear that you've done this kind of or in the process of doing this? Any confusion about this? No. Great. Shall we move on to like actually implementing the form and what that looks like? Okay, so we're fetching data, so we're doing the read and we're creating elements. Let's actually go ahead and implement the form. So I've got my server.js. It has one endpoint to deal with the fetch. In order for it to actually work, I'm going to need a few more input fields, so I can go ahead and implement those. So we have form for name, and these can be in the form group, ideally, as Bootstrap likes to group them. And then we can have, and the name here is name. And then we can have, I think there's type for type. And then damage, right? And the type for that can be number. And this one will be called damage. So this is our form here. I think it's form control, is that right? Something like that. Let's go with that. Okay, so we've got our form here. What will happen when I hit submit here? I can't type in text here, I have to type in numbers. What will happen when I click submit here? It will try and do a post. The browser will immediately do a post to /creatures or /things, whatever is stated in there. The reason it will do a post is method equals post. If you omit method, it defaults to get. So let's see that in action. Click submit. Cannot post to /creatures. We see an error in the browser. So we need to implement that /post. Similar to TinyApp, right? Except we're not going to be getting, we want to keep it as a AJAX request. So we have to be careful about that. So app.post /creatures. Here I'm not going to add .json because actually, I mean I could add .json, but I'm not submitting JSON, I'm only getting back JSON. So it's a little bit more obscure in that way. Request response. And in here, I am, for now, just going to console log request.body, I guess. Is that okay? As like a debugging step? We need to restart our server. And we're doing /creatures post and console logging the body. Okay, cool. So if I refresh even on this cannot post, it should be able to, oops, I forgot to, it's just spinning, because I forgot to response dot send something. So let's restart from that. And maybe we would just want to request.send. It's okay, that's good enough. So let's refresh, and I get back a hello, and then in my console I see it log the actual information coming from the form. Each input field with its name attribute. So in this case, the name attribute is name attribute is type, name attribute is damage. Everything comes up as a string. So we have to be careful about things like the damage being a string and not a number, right? So here we need to make an AJAX request as well. We don't want it to submit this way because we don't want the page to change. We want to stay on the same page. So what we actually need to do is on the client side, my error condition is that when I submit the form, it takes me here. I don't want that to happen. I don't want it to be like TinyApp. I want it to behave like one single page application where it doesn't switch pages, right? And I want it to stay on the same HTML, same JavaScript. And so instead of submitting the form, I'm actually going to hijack that form. So in my client-side JavaScript file, right when the document is loaded, so not inside of a callback function or anything, just inside of this callback function here, which is for document ready, I'm going to have logic to augment the behavior of the submit or create form. How am I going to do that? $, gonna obviously need to reference the form itself, which we can do by ID or some other selector. So we'll call it something like creatures form. And we will attach a submit handler to that form. So on submit of that form, we're going to have a callback function. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, good call. Wouldn't it be #creatures form because it's by ID? Yes. If you're using document.query, document.getElement by ID, then you don't need it. But for jQuery, you definitely need the pound or the dot, depending on what you're selecting by. Okay, so in here, again, working incrementally. Console log, maybe just the event for now. Oops, wrong page. We're on /homepage. And looks like right away I have missing initializer in const declaration, syntax error, line 29. Oh, so somewhere I'm missing an equal sign? Oh, line 29. Okay, yeah, let's take a look. Oh, yeah. Const append creature. We never really tested that. See the challenges of not testing code that you write previously? There we go. Wait, so how was this? Oh, because I never tested this particular separation. So append creature is being called with the element, and we are returning the element. So in theory, that should work, but I forgot to test that step. Okay. So here, submit. I don't think I needed to restart, but just to be safe. And then I've got my, I seem to be console logging something, but that's my creatures as I loop through them. So that's for the get, where I console log right here. So if I take out that console log, I shouldn't have any. And now I've apparently just added a submit handler to form submit. When I click submit, I didn't really know what to expect, and it seemed like console didn't log anything, and it seemed to have the exact same behavior as before. So that's not what I expected. Why would it be that even though I've attached a submit handler to the form, And in that handler, I've got a console log, so I should see something in the console that nothing shows up. Any guesses?
The form is still post.
The form will still post. Is that what you were going to say, Rachel?
Oh, I was going to say probably the wrong thing, which is that you have to remove the default behavior.
That's also correct. So both of you are correct, just saying the answer differently. The form is still doing its default behavior, which Darren from Calgary is saying that the form is still doing its default behavior, which is posting. So I need to hijack that behavior and tell it not to do its default behavior. I need to prevent that default. But I can still see the console log. Before even doing that, what I can do is, where is it? In my console, I should have preserve log. So if I do that, it's going to preserve log messages between pages. Because what happened is it went to the next page, and in doing so, it cleared the log automatically. Don't want that to happen. Let's try it again, just so that we're clear. Submit, and still no console log. Let's try that again. Navigated. Submit. Nothing. So it seems like we're doing something else that's wrong here. Creatures form dot on submit, and let's try that. That's interesting. Not what I expected. Make sure we have the right. Oh, you know why? Look at what I got burnt by. I forgot to save index.html once I renamed the form. So it was actually not working because of another reason. Because I forgot to save this change. Okay, so let's go back, refresh, and now I still expect it to do the default behavior, but I also expect console logs to start working. Okay. So with that working, what I need to do is tell it to stop doing the default behavior and not actually do the default form submission. So that would be event.prevent default. You might find documentation or Stack Overflow asking you to do return false to prevent default, but it does actually two things. So if you want to look into what does return false do here in jQuery, you can Google that. I won't go into it right now. So the better approach is to do prevent default. And then here we're going to make our, well, let's test that out. So now if I hit submit, I don't expect for it to do anything on the network side because it's not trying to submit. So there's no network post request happening, and we don't see anything happening on the tab side either. Questions, thoughts, anything? Yep. Is this still doing post is the question. If we look in the network tab, and if I, let's say, even clear the network tab just to make it easy for me to debug this, and I click submit multiple times, it's not working. I've actually told it to not behave like it normally does and not submit. So now it's just a form that doesn't do anything. Oh, crap. 5% battery. Good point. Let me quickly grab my power. It's on my desk. I didn't expect it to drain so quickly. Sorry. Why would we want to hijack the form and not let it behave like a form? Because the default behavior of a form is to not submit using AJAX. And so we have to do all that work ourselves. There's no built-in like attribute that I can add to a form to say, please do the form submission asynchronously. Please don't take over the entire tab and do the thing that isn't AJAX. Right? And so we have to actually do the legwork ourselves in now making another XML HTTP request using either jQuery or some other library. Except instead of a GET request, we're going to do a POST request. That's the difference. So my next inclination would be to jQuery POST AJAX because I want to post instead of GET. And notice what comes up is a POST. As it turns out, this is much like GetJSON that we used earlier. This is another nice little wrapper around $AJAX that allows it to do a POST. This is shorthand for the AJAX function, which is equivalent to type POST, URL, data, success, data type. So in here, we will actually do, might as well do a POST, so it saves us that AJAX thing. But we could do $.AJAX with all of those, with like type POST as well. So we'll do a .post and pass in the URL that we're, because that's what's expected, of course, is the URL or the path. So we'll be going to /creatures. And we'll be passing up data as well, won't we? Because data is the next thing. So here what we need to do is actually pass in some attributes. But because I don't know how, I'm just going to hard code it for now. Again, working incrementally. Just to see what would happen. And then this is my callback function. We don't know what's coming back here, so let's just say response. And we're just going to console log response. And hope that this works, but really we're doing it in a kind of experimental way to see what happens in the network tab and what's sent up, how does it look, all of that stuff. So let's go back to our fictional creatures, refresh. I'm hijacking the form, and then I'm doing a post request where I, upon completion, console log the response. Not sure what my hypothesis is. Something should be printed to console log with a response. It really depends on what my server-side logic is. Looks like it sends back a hello, right? So I should probably expect to see a hello in my console log. Wow, looks like I indeed got a hello back because I console logged the response. And in my network tab, if I look at XHR, there was the initial download of the creatures, which we already implemented, and then there was a post. And as part of the request, look at what it passed up. So it's just like form data, exactly in the same way that form data is sent up when we do a regular form behavior. And so I don't need to do anything different on my server side because the server just gets a request that happens to be a post, happens to be for /creatures, and includes request.body parameters, because it's coming in through form data like we normally do with TinyApp. Right? So there's no difference here. So, I mean, of course, I don't want to hard code this, but on the server side, I expect to see request.body include name KV. And indeed we do. So we see that that data is coming up, and we can parse it just like we could before. Any questions about that so far? We're not done yet, but I just want to make sure you're not confused by anything I've done so far. So the question is, instead of sending up name KV, could you send up hard HTML tags? Yes, you could, but it's not really a common thing that you need to do. To send up HTML is not really all that common. One example of sending up HTML is, let's say you have like a WYSIWYG editor. It's part of like WordPress or some kind of content management system or blogging system or something where the user is able to edit the body of a page. Then they're potentially like updating some HTML. In that case, you'd still send up a key value pair, but the key would be something like content, and the value would be a string with the HTML that they filled out in that text area. Right? It wouldn't just be HTML. It would still be wrapped in a form data using name value. Good question, though. Whoops. With that working, we really need to actually append to the creatures. Yes, I'm hard coding name KV, but whatever, we'll still append that up. It doesn't matter too much for our test purposes, and then we can make it more accurate. So how would we append it? Well, we kind of did something a little bit wrong here, where we had the creatures defined inside of this callback function. So if we try to append to creatures, let's say a creature is name, request.body.name, type, request.body.type, and what was the other one? Damage, request.body.damage. Yes, they're not coming up, so they're undefined. That's okay. And we want to append this creature object to creatures. Creatures.push, right? Creature. The problem is that I expect this to error out because creatures is not an array that's accessible by this function, since it's defined in this inner scope, right? If we had our URLs defined here, we would have the same problem in TinyApp. So let's just make sure I get that error. What I expect right now when I hit submit is a 500 coming back. As we can see, it's red here. And when I click on it, response is indeed a 500. And we can even see the error coming back from Express, since it's, developer friendly in that way. Creatures is not defined. And we'll see the same error on the server side. So we need to define creatures, and we already have it defined, so let's just move it up to our global or outer scope here. Let's make sure our indentation is good as we do that, and let's restart. And we now find that when I hit submit here, it doesn't matter what I fill in, it'll always submit name KV. And now, apparently, I have no way of testing. I've appended to creatures another creature. Right? So it would be nice if I could actually see the data show up again and for it to refresh here. Right? So that's my error condition right now, which is I can't see the creatures. Now, the easiest way to debug that is just to console log creatures right here, just to make sure. And we see that it actually has 3 elements. This one's missing ID, and it was name KV with no type and no damage. So let's actually have it so that we can actually see the creature show up maybe at the bottom of the list right when we submit a creature. So we have more AJAX work to do, because now, yes, the form is being submitted, but the DOM is not updating. We have to do that, right? We're not reloading, we're not redirecting to a page here. And so we have to do that work ourselves. What do you think we should do? The answer is render from, what's your name again? X, yes. So X is saying render. You're right, we have to render. But are you saying render on Express? Because we're already kind of rendering or sending back some string that we're not doing anything with. Perhaps we could send back the creature, right? Perhaps we could send back the creature data and append it as part of our response. Another strategy that we could do is, because creatures is already updated, why don't we just refetch all of the creatures and go through that whole logic of doing the fetch.
Remove the send and replace it with render.
Replace the send with render is the answer from Calgary. The thing with render is, though, this is a common confusion. Render does server-side rendering of taking a template, like a EJS template, and sending down HTML. We could send down HTML, which could potentially be the div class equals creature, but we already have client-side code that can take data about a creature, like the JSON payload, the object, and turn it into the right element. So a server-side render here, although it could work, is not a good solution here, because it would kind of be inconsistent with how we're actually building the client-side divs and things like that. The way we're doing it is we want a JSON separation between the server and the client, and the server should only really be sending back JSON. So I would argue that you actually keep it with a send, but you only just send down the creature. Now, you can choose to use that or not. So for example, if you're sending down the creature, your client-side code could be, okay, the response is now actually going to be the creature. Let's just confirm that. Let's refresh here. Let's open up our console that we're going to log. And what I expect to happen, oh, and also when I refresh this, it's nice to see that KV is there. That's another way of verifying because it does a refetch. But let's actually do a submit here. And after starting our server, which I forgot to do, now I'm getting back an object. So I could actually just take that object and pass it to my append creature function, because that object is the same object that I would get back from my fetch. So append creature, and then we can call that creature. Right? So in my callback function, I am basically saying, oh, I got the actual creature that was created. Let's append that to the list that we already have on the page. Let me, before I get to your question, let me just refresh and show what this looks like. Those fields don't matter since we're still saying KV. And KV comes back. And, oh, it didn't actually append like I expected. So we still have just Bigfoot there. So what is the reason for that? Oh, append creature takes in, my mistake. Append creature, what does it take in? It takes in the element. We forgot to create an element first. So I actually have to first do const element equals create creature element, 1 or 2, pass in the data, then append that element to the DOM. Same thing we were doing as we were looping through initially. The exact same code. And if I hit submit now, it gets back this, which it appends. So we can see as I submit, it's doing the request, and then it's also client side. Because it was successful, it's adding the thing manually to the DOM itself. Yeah, so this is a good question. What's actually happening here is really what you're asking in different words. Well, if I refresh the page, what do I expect? Because when I refresh the page on page load, it fetches all of the data. So that's like what truly resembles, okay, what's actually in the database? So if I refresh, what do I expect? Do I expect all of these KVs to be in the database? My answer is yes, because I submitted the form like 6 times, and I've hard-coded name KV each time. And so there should be whatever 6 or 7 KVs. As I just hit refresh, we can see that it fetches all of that data. So unless I restart the node server, that database has been updated. Let's actually do a quick write-up of what we did here so we fully understand. Because if you have that question, I'm sure everybody else has that question. We load the page. We make an AJAX get to /creatures. We convert the array of objects to elements, appending them each time. Now the user is ready to submit the form. And here jQuery intercepts the form submission with our callback. We'll call that CB. So our callback performs an async or AJAX request with post and a payload, which means some form data or some kind of data. In this case, it's just name KV. Upon success, jQuery calls our success callback. What I'm referring to there is the post callback right here, the success callback. And then in our success callback, we, knowing that it was successful, knowing that the save was successful, we modify the UI to look correct. And correct means it now has that record. So we're manually syncing up the UI with what's in the database, instead of relying on a page load. Because if we refresh the page, yeah, it's there because when we refresh the page, it gets the array of the objects that are currently there. So yes, if we were to redirect back to this page in the way we do with Tiny App, we don't have to do this extra work. But because we're creating a single page app, we have to modify the DOM ourselves to keep it in sync with the database. Does this clarify things for you, John, or is it still confusing?
No, a little bit. Just one semantic issue. On line 25,
Yep.
you had calls out. You said calls our success.
Oh, so calls. Thank you. Typo. Now I'm going a little bit over time, but I did start a little bit late. 11:11. Can I have a few more minutes of your time? Is that okay? One of the things we didn't do is we did not actually take our form data seriously, so we should fix that. Agreed? So instead of this, we'll just call this data, and we'll do const data, and we could just paste it there, and we're doing the same thing. But really what we need to do is serialize the form data into the object. So I could do this manually using, you know, jQueries like .val. So I could do things like whatever the form input is, .val, 3 times. One for name, one for damage, one for type. And that would be .val basically goes and for that DOM element tries to extract the value attribute. Okay, it can be used to set or get the value, very similar to .text on a DOM node. So I could do it that way, but there's a more convenient way. So I'm just going to keep that as a commented out code. And you know, these IDs are what you'd have to assign IDs or classes or something to be able to fetch from those input elements. But we're not going to do it that way. What we can do is we can use a shortcut, which is take our form and serialize it. Now this will actually not work, and we'll talk about why, but this should work. Because what this is, according to jQuery, let's see if they actually talk about this anywhere in their documentation. Yeah, right here. So here they actually use the form and doing a post to this test PHP endpoint. They're doing the same thing where they're saying, let's take the data from the form, right? But you could also use this instead of the form. Let's actually do it their way, which is to take the form by ID. What's the form called? Creatures form. So this is essentially what will work, but I want to talk about why it won't work with this, so that you're not caught off guard by that. You did? Okay, so it's recap? Yeah, exactly. So it has to do with the arrow function. Is that what you were saying? Yeah, so it looks like we can skip that then because it has to do with the arrow function. So I'll leave it like this in the code because we are using an arrow function, but the other option is to use this here and turn this from an arrow function to a regular function expression, right? So let's just make sure this is working because we just wrote some code. Want to make sure it's working. Refresh, inspect, console. Let's put in something here. I need a fictional creature. How about like dragon monkey? Yeah, dragon monkey. And type flying. And we can see the data there like that is actually a string. Name equals dragon monkey and type equals flying and damage equals 10. And if we look at our network tab for the post, let's go into all. The post in the headers still includes the form data. So in our first example, we used an object with name KV, and jQuery was smart enough to turn that into form data. And in the case of this, serialize actually returns a string, which jQuery also accepts as a valid form data. So you can do either or, and ultimately it always ends up looking like this because this is how HTTP expects the form data to be sent up. We're just seeing it nicely parsed by dev tools like this. And so what I expect now is on the server, Dragon Monkey to have been added to the array because I sent up the right data, not hard-coded to KV. I didn't assign an ID to it, so I would have like a global variable called ID that I would increment each time. Whatever, we can skip that, and you can try and implement that yourself if you like in this example that I'll share with you, or just imagine it. Another thing I didn't cover in this lecture that has been covered sometimes by other instructors in this lecture is the topic of promises. And so I will only just introduce the topic of promises because the goal in this lecture isn't to get you comfortable with promises to the point where you can explain them or talk about them in a tech interview or something like that. That will come with time. Okay? So you will, starting next week, or maybe even starting this week, start to use promises, and maybe starting next week, start to be comfortable with what the hell is actually happening. Okay? Because we do believe that it's possible to use something without fully understanding what it is or why it exists. So you remember at the beginning of the lecture I was saying how like jQuery's API kept evolving, and we have multiple ways of doing the same thing. Well, one of the other ways that you can actually implement this, both this one or the get that we do at the beginning of the page, is to use a promise pattern where you don't actually pass in the callback right into the function call. So the callback is no longer here. Take it out. So we're just passing these two things. Okay? And what this does is, according to the documentation, a post returns an object. And on that object, which is kind of like a promise, we're able to then attach callbacks. And then, using the then function, we're able to attach our callback. So all I did was take that callback and move it one step further, which is instead of passing it in directly, I actually call another function, or method I should say, on this return object. So post returns a promise, or promise-like object to be more accurate. It's not a full promise. And we then say when this promise is completed or fulfilled, when this promise is done, right, please trigger this function, which is very similar to what we were doing before, just slightly different semantics. And I should expect to see some eyebrows raised, and I'm already seeing some, in terms of WTF, right? If you're saying this does the same thing, what's it for? All I'll say right now is that this is a better pattern that's picked up more in recent years, let's call it the last 5 years in the JavaScript ecosystem, and has become kind of more common than the approach of just passing in a callback directly. So you'll continue to use libraries like jQuery and beyond that will use the promise pattern, and you should become comfortable using the promise pattern. So when you're doing AJAX calls yourself in Tweeter, try to use this pattern instead of putting in the success callback directly into post or get JSON or whatever you're using as your AJAX function. So let's just quickly see and make sure this actually works and I'm not lying to you, and fix the indentation, right? Because let's just take a quick look at this. I'm calling post, but I'm not semicolonning it. So really, that's the reason that I'm indenting the next line. Just like when I was creating the DOM nodes, I was indenting not because I was in an if statement or in a loop, but just to be clear that this dot is actually on the previous line. So same thing here. This then is actually being called on the return value of this. Exact same. So that's why we're indenting it. And since it takes in a callback, we have to indent the contents of the callback as well. Now let's actually take a look and make sure this works. So refresh. It's just client-side change, so we still expect this to work. Submit. Indeed, it does, at least does the submit. And did it actually, yep, looked like it executed the callback correctly because the callback is where we append it to the DOM. Right? The last thing I'll say before I adjourn and send out the notes is One of the benefits of this is that you can actually chain additional behavior to a promise. What additional behavior would we want to chain? Are there additional callbacks we would want to register on this particular interaction with the server? Exactly. If it didn't work, what about the error condition? Because we've done this whole lecture, happy path, right? Everything is working great. Not exactly how you should be coding. So the one thing you should do differently than the lecture is also, as you go, both write and test out the error conditions. So in this case, it would be dot, and I actually forget, I think it's dot catch, and then you would have an error. And then you would want to do something in the DOM, like maybe show a red message saying, append a red paragraph to the top of the list saying, failed to submit, and maybe the reason for failing, which you would get back from the server. But here I'm just going to console log it just to demonstrate that. So let's take a look at that and see how we would do that. So refresh. Unfortunately, it's not going to hit the console log. So how could we simulate that? One of the things we could do is just have it maybe not support a post. What if the post is just broken and a 404? I wonder what that will do. Let's call it. Notice that we got back a console log. At this point we can, for example, we could alert. But again, you would want to do something a little bit nicer. Right? And so, much like with the jQuery chaining, we can chain things to a promise, like then and catch. There are other functions that apparently are very similar or synonymous. So there's a .done and there's a .then. You can read up on the differences and the history, or you can just choose to use .then and .catch and worry about learning that difference later. Up to you. Sorry for going over time. I saw a hand go up, and if Calgary also has any questions, let's do that before we adjourn. Question?
I was just wondering if the promise is comprised of all of the data that we've submitted, or if each time that we submit and go through, if it is taking different parcels of the data that we're looking at.
So the question is, like with using promises, do we have to do the .then for each promise, I think is what you're asking indirectly? And then the data itself that's coming back is the same as before, because the server is still sending back a creature payload, a creature object as JSON. And so all we've done is taken that callback from here, where it used to be, right, and moved it into a function call that we attached later. So there's no other change really in terms of how we use the client-side jQuery code. And we didn't change anything on the server to implement promises. So it seems to be just a different way of using jQuery or other libraries like jQuery. This is the more modern approach to using asynchronous code, is instead of attaching the callback directly, you attach the callback afterward. And that allows you to attach multiple callbacks, and you can keep adding them. But you don't have to worry about that. Right now you probably need 1 for success and 1 for failure. You could have 10 for success and 10 for failure. You're just not normally going to do that. This is regular JavaScript. This is something that jQuery had to support. And so later versions of jQuery had to actually add this in. Now, let's not be confused here. We did not avoid using callbacks. Promises need to use callbacks because asynchronous code, from what we know, yeah, just the order of it changes. Exactly. Exactly. Any other things? Anything from Calgary? So again, apologies for being rusty and going a little bit over time. Hopefully this was useful. I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover in terms of my hidden agenda with this. You could use success callback, but again, please try to use this approach even though you don't fully understand it. And just know that this is going to be a gap that you need to fill, and we'll help you fill it with additional lectures on promises. I promise we will have a lecture on promises. But much like in bootcamp, you'll be using them, and then you'll get comfortable with them kind of over time. Okay? Enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck catching up with yesterday's content and with today's. Don't get too stressed out with being half day behind or whatever. It is quite normal. Okay? Cheers.